3, 2, 1.
Well, what's going on, friends? Welcome back to another episode of the Metaverse Church podcast. Today, it is just me. This one's going to be a little bit different of an episode because when this one's being recorded, we are smack dab in the middle of getting ready for Easter services, both at Cornerstone VR and Lakeland VR. And if you're familiar with the church world at all when it comes to Christmas, Easter time, it is like getting ready for the Super Bowl, and there's tons to do. So this week, we thought that we would kind of strip back a little bit. I reached out to Goose and said, "Hey, do you mind if I just take this one on my own, just to keep things up and going?" And he was like, "Dude, go for it." So I'm coming at you with this episode. Really, it's going to be really maybe not so much new information that I'm going to bring at you. But it's just a nice little recap because, again, our heartbeat behind even the reason why we're doing this podcast, Goose and myself, is because we really want to bring some legitimacy to the idea of church and virtual reality, and those two things going hand in hand with each other. And if there's anything that I've learned within the past really few months lately, keep in mind, I've been doing this for about 2 years now, being a pastor within virtual reality. But if there's anything that I've learned within the past few months, is that this thing called church and virtual reality is really starting to gain some momentum. There's a lot of people who are asking a lot of really great questions. Wow. People are asking really great questions right now, really surrounding that idea about what does it mean? What does it look like to do church in virtual reality? And it was because we were getting those types of questions is the whole reason why Goose and I put together this podcast. So that being said, I know that a lot of you who listen to this, you've been in the virtual reality spaces. You've either hung out with us at Lakeland VR, or you've hung out over at Cornerstone, or you do a little bit of both, or you've hung out with some of our friends in the other churches within the VR space. So a lot of you are probably familiar with this, but at the same time, we do understand, Goose and I, that eventually church leadership, they're going to find their way to this podcast, whether that's because you shared it or they're just looking for church in the metaverse. And it just so happens that this podcast comes up. So every so often, we want to do a really good job of making sure that we are putting our best foot forward in the sense of giving the already established churches as well a reason why they should be diving into the metaverse and planting a church or launching a church in virtual reality. So I want to come today and just give a couple of different reasons why the church is needed in virtual reality. But even before I dive into that, I also want to say, because we are smack dab in the middle of the Easter season, or by the time that you're listening to this, we'll be outside of that season. But I did get the opportunity to hang out with our friends over at Cornerstone with Goose for their Good Friday service. And it was absolutely amazing over in VR chat. I'm not as versed in VR chat as Goose is and some other people. I see that there's a need. I know that there's a lot of potential behind it, but I've never played around long enough in there to really have any kind of say whatsoever. But I will say kudos to the Cornerstone team for what they did with their Stations of the Cross in VR chat on Friday. It was absolutely stunning. The environment that they put together, and just even the way that they went about doing it, with just the different team members chiming in, bringing in a devotional based off of the Station across that they were at the time. And it was just absolutely amazing. So let me encourage you, if you don't get the opportunity to hop over there at any point in time, reach out to Goose, whether that's on the Discord or you just shoot us an email here at the Metaverse Church Podcast at gmail.com. Reach out to Goose and just ask him, like, hey, is there any opportunity that I can walk through that? Again, I know I heard some photographs going off, so they probably have some still images. I got some still images myself, but it really was an amazing experience. So I want to give kudos to Cornerstone and what they did for Good Friday services this past weekend. And we've said this before, but I think one of the other things that's just beautiful about the church and the metaverse is just the collaboration that goes on within the the bride of Christ in the virtual spaces, because not only did I have the opportunity to go and support them, but they then in turn came and supported us as we put together our Good Friday service in Spatial. And so it was just a really good time. So reach out to Goose, ask him if there's any way that you too can take a tour through their Good Friday experience, if they still have it up. If not, it'll come around again next year. It'll be amazing. It'll probably even better. But yeah, so again, knowing that most likely at some point in time, whether it is currently or way in the future, some church leadership or some individual who's looking at planning a church in virtual reality is going to come across this podcast. So if that's you, hi, welcome. I'm Stuart. But I wanted to put some numbers and a reason why there is a need for the church in virtual reality. So I'll preface this way. I did recently just write a blog article for thechurch.digital, and 3 of my reasons why I got published on this blog. So I'm going to kind of take a little bit from there, and also I'm going to take from our good friend ChatGPT, which if you've been following this podcast for any length in time now, you know that Goose has kind of been using ChatGPT in order to bring us some great one-off questions just for fun. So I'm using both of those, the blog that I wrote and ChatGPT, to kind of collab this podcast episode for you in order to really lay down a solid foundation as to why the church needs to be in the virtual reality spaces and within the metaverse. So if I were to just start with mine I felt were pretty simple and basic in the approach. My 3 reasons were because the user base calls for it. And what I mean by that is, as of this year, so we're in 2023, actually, I guess it was in 2022, I came across an article from the Academy of Animated Art. So their website is the academyofanimatedart.com, and they were giving numbers to virtual reality users within 2022, and then they were projecting into 2023. And what they found is that in 2022, there were 171 million current users within virtual reality. And then because we are based here in the United States, whether that's Cornerstones in Yuba City or Goose in Florida, and then Lakeland VR in Wisconsin, the current user base within the United States alone is roughly 63 million users, and the projection for this for that number is to continue to grow in the coming years. So, and at this point in time, there's about maybe 20 or so churches that are in the virtual reality spaces right now. Now, that's not including our friends over at Lux Digital Church and J Live, who are doing amazing things on Twitch streams, and some video game churches that are going on. But just within the virtual reality spaces, there's only probably about 20 churches for 171 million people. Now, I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I grew up going to church primarily in a church plant. And here's the amazing thing: whether no matter what your context is, where you are at geographically, most likely, this isn't for everybody, I understand that, but most likely, especially if you live in the United States, you probably know a church planner. And you've probably heard their vision casting and their story about how they're getting ready to plant a church in their local context, in their local expression, in order to reach the people that nobody else is yet reaching. Now, the church that I grew up in, when I grew up in Albuquerque, the city of Albuquerque at the time was probably over 400,000 people. And yet I grew up in a church plant because somebody saw the need in order to reach those that weren't being reached. Because at the time, and probably still today, if I were to be honest with you, the city of Albuquerque and the state of New Mexico as a whole was about 90% lost. So a major opportunity to reach those who have not yet been reached, to introduce people to Jesus, even though there were tons of local expression of churches already physically planted and established in the city of Albuquerque. So I would argue that if the current user base in virtual reality is 171 million users, 364 in the U 63, 64 million alone in the United States, with only 20 churches. I would argue that if that's the numbers for virtual reality, but we are willing to see the need and plant physical churches and physical spaces of 400,000 with 90% loss, I would argue that the user base it calls for people to plant more churches within virtual reality because the user base is there. And if we're planting churches for locations that are 90% lost, I can almost guarantee that the loss percentage within these virtual spaces are probably a lot higher than 90%. So if we're willing to do this in the physical spaces for a less population and a high percentage of lost people, then the user base calls for us to plant virtual reality churches with 171 million people, and a high percentage of those people being lost with only 20 churches. So that's one reason. The other reason is that the anonymity, which we've talked about in a previous episode, it really just demands it. The fact that people are more open to conversation, to bring their questions into these spaces, really demands for the church to be there. Because if our whole goal is to be able to introduce people to Jesus, right? There's something broken. We know that something doesn't feel right within this world, but yet Jesus is the answer and is the hope, and he puts those broken pieces back together. It's the fact that the anonymity of virtual reality allows people to be more transparent and more open with their questions and with their hurts, their habits, and their hangups, that it demands for the church to be there in order to be the answer and to bring along the solution. If people are going to YouTube and Google in order to answer questions like, why is there so much hurt in this world? Why is there so much pain? If people are hopping into spaces like that in order to receive the answers that they're looking for, then the church better be there in order to provide the answer. So if the user base calls for it and the anonymity demands it, then the other reason why is because businesses are validating the need for the church to be in virtual reality. Now, you might be saying, how in the world does current businesses validate the need for churches to be in virtual reality? Well, you think back like early 2000s, maybe late 1990s, businesses were providing cell phones to their current employees in order to boost productivity, in order to stay connected, all those kinds of things. So a cell phone was more of a business tool than it was a luxury. You fast forward a few years, Apple all of a sudden drops their cell phone. And by the time that I was in high school, 2003, 2002, 2006, that time frame, cell phones became more of a luxury. In fact, my parents wanted to make sure that they were able to stay connected with me, that they got me my own cell phone. But even before that ever happened, I was able to have my hands on their cell phone in order to play Snake, right? Awesome game. Absolutely loved it. But because cell phones were such a mandatory need within businesses were investing in the idea of being able to put a cell phone in their employees' pockets, and those things ended up making their way home, which then allowed the households to be able to see, hey, there's kind of a need, or this is kind of a blessing in disguise. Maybe we should go get some for the entire family. So it's because the business's investment that ends up turning a tool into a luxury. And within 2023, the projection is 23 million businesses like Apple and Google, Microsoft, you name it. They're all diving into virtual reality. They're expanding, they're exploring, and they're diving deep into these platforms, which means as businesses are diving further into this, what they are turning into a tool is eventually going to turn more into a luxury item that's going to end up in every single household. And that's why I say 171 million today is going to be a heck of a lot more tomorrow. So again, those three things alone really tell us, it tells us why the user base calls for us to be there, the anonymity demands for us to be there, and the businesses are validating the church and being virtual reality. So those were my reasons. That's why I pushed for. But I also did reach out to ChatGPT and I just said, hey, give me some reasons why the church needs to be in virtual reality spaces. And this was Chat's response back. So Chad said, for reason number one, in order to reach new audiences, which is absolutely true. In fact, the statement that Chad put on here was one of the biggest advantages of virtual reality is the ability to reach new audiences. The Christian church has traditionally struggled to engage with the younger generations who are increasingly turning away from organized religion. Absolutely true. However, I would also say virtual reality is also helping us reach the audience members that are in a older generation, older demographic. We've talked about this also before on this podcast before, that when we hopped in, Lakeland VR hopped into AltSpace VR when it was still around. I think the thing that surprised us the most was that the users in there were about twice the age of myself and our next gen director, who hopped into spearheading our launching into virtual reality. So yes, while VR is providing an opportunity for churches to reach a new audience and a younger generation, it's also helping us to reconnect with an audience and a generation that has maybe found themselves moving away from the church as well. The second reason that ChatGPT gave for the need for church and virtual reality was it overcomes geographical barriers. Absolutely. Just even hopping in with Cornerstone for their Good Friday service, just being in there alone, you could hear different regions being represented in just the conversations that were going on. And it's absolutely wonderful when you have Peter Griffin as an avatar, you have a wolf as an avatar, a robot as an avatar. Me, I was walking around like a little skull face, little goth kid kind of looking thing as an avatar. And all of a sudden you realize you don't see the difference of the individual behind the avatar. You can hear it. And even when you hear it, you can start understanding and realizing, man, what this is providing is the opportunity for the church to overcome those geographical barriers. And it's absolutely amazing when the church has been called, when the disciples, us, have been called to go and make disciples all over the world. And VR is providing us the opportunity to do that. Third reason, it creates an immersive worship experience. Again, I can call back to just the Good Friday service and what Cornerstone put on. The Good Friday service and our Easter services that we are doing at Lakeland VR. Absolutely amazing. I absolutely love what we have going on over there. And then our friends over at Oasis Church VR, excuse me, everything that they do is just absolutely amazing with how they take these biblical stories that we're all familiar with, and they bring a new twist on it in order to be more immersive into what the context of the Bible has to say, and it makes it come alive. There's a guy that I've met in virtual spaces named Chet. He does the same thing where you're able to walk through the Red Sea. You can experience Noah's Ark and all that kind of stuff. And it's just absolutely amazing how we can take what are words on the Bible, or what's words on page, and turn it into an immersive way of being able to understand what the story really represents and what it almost felt like to be in that time period, and to experience what these biblical characters that we're familiar with experienced as well. The fourth reason is it provides a safe space for exploration. Again, that goes back to the anonymity. People are able to more freely come into these virtual reality churches and bring questions that they've always had without being too concerned that the person that they're sitting across from is going to judge them based off of their questions or their stories, because they can't see our face and we can't see theirs, which provides a whole new level of authenticity and getting to the root problem that they're facing in order to help them take a next step on their spiritual journey, which is what any one of us would want as a follower of Jesus and a church leader. And then ChatGPT's fifth and final response was it's adapting to the changing times. And if you listen to any podcast that has to talk about the church and technology, what you will probably most commonly hear is that the church has always probably been one of the last organization, or one of the last period to ever adapt to the changing times. And yet we are currently in a place where the church can be the ones that are on the forefront of a changing time, such as the metaverse, church and virtual reality, where we could be the ones who are blazing the trail to get into there and really set the foundation and set the temperature on what spaces like that can be when it comes to how to interact with people and to build community, and to just be there for each other. So again, those are just 3 of my reasons why the church needs to be in virtual reality. Those are just 5 simple responses that ChatGPT gave for why the church needs to be in virtual reality. And again, the whole purpose of this episode was we want to, as part of that heartbeat, be able to provide simple reasons and a clear why every church, whether that's you as a church leader, why your church needs to be in virtual reality. So I have actually had conversations with people where they've asked, like, hey, the more churches that hop into VR, do you feel like it's going to turn into a competition for space and for attention? And my honest opinion on that is, one, no. I don't think that will ever be the case. And I think the reason why is because of what I said earlier. The church is collaborating in a much more beautiful way than what I've ever experienced in real life churches. And that's not a knock on in real life churches. I just think that these platforms require for churches to work together in order to reach different people. And I would even strongly argue, if there's 171 million users right now in virtual reality, I would say that calls for 171 million churches to be in there. And I know that's a big number, and I know that seems ridiculous, but what we do at Lakeland VR is not the same as what Goose and their team does over at Cornerstone VR. But at the same time, we're also not reaching Cornerstone people, and Cornerstone's not reaching Lakeland VR people, and Oasis isn't reaching either one of those two, and so on and so forth. So we need more churches in the space in order to reach people, because we're all going to do something different, and it's all going to speak differently to people as well. So I just don't see it ever being a combative thing. I just see it being a collab thing. And that's why I can honestly say we need more churches within virtual reality. And hopefully coming soon, we will even be talking a little bit about that here on this podcast. But that's it for this episode. Again, thank you for tuning in to the Metaverse Church podcast. If you want to reach out to us, you can simply do so by hopping over to our Discord or shooting us an email. Both of those links will be in the show notes. Please leave a rating and review, share and subscribe to this podcast. Doing all those kinds of things help get this out to more people. And all that being said, I will be back with Goose next week, and we will continue on with what's supposed to be part 2. This episode was supposed to be anyways, but we will hop into part 2 of doing small groups and within virtual reality. Again, this one's going to be more of a focus on gaming platforms, which I'm really excited about, because I truly believe that's where God's wanting us to press into next. So I hope you have a great week. We'll see you next time. Be blessed.